Welcome to the New England Synod Child Safety Training. Before we begin, it's important to establish norms for our training. Although participation is encouraged in any sort of training, no one is required to speak. And if you speak, be mindful of others who may wish to speak. Be respectful of time constraints. All opinions are heard with respect, and there are no stupid answers or questions. If you've experienced child abuse, you are strongly encouraged to address this with a trusted professional. This training that you are about to watch with others is not a safe or appropriate occasion for disclosure about your own abuse. And if the material becomes uncomfortable for you, please do what is necessary to care for yourself. Humor helps, and humor is the ability to see the funny side of life or to laugh at oneself without hurtful words or actions towards others. The great norm for working together is trust. We must have trust in the other person to do the right thing. Kindness are acts of caring for one another, and hopefully we all do this work because of our kindness. And we must have freedom to make a mistake. A mistake is to risk being wrong in order to find an answer or solution. We also must have freedom to speak our own mind, and that is the ability to share our ideas, even when those that may not be accepted by others. We must be authentic, and that's the ability, of course, to be yourself without pretending to be another in order to be accepted and liked. And we will talk a lot today about safety, which is a principle for our training and all that we do. Safety means maintaining a boundary around your personal well-being that's physical and emotional. And compassion is important in our training today, and that is a deep sense of caring for the feelings, well-being, and experience of others. Respect recognizes that everyone counts, and we must honor diversity in all that we do, respecting how difference can enrich every community. If we were all the same, life would be pretty boring. Here are some things about boundaries that are important to know when you're talking about child safety or safety with anyone. Boundaries help other people to know how to treat you. Boundaries define your sense of self. Boundaries delineate how much you have to give. Boundaries are dividing lines between you and everyone else that represents both physical and emotional limits others may not violate. And boundaries separate your needs, wants, desires, thoughts, and feelings from others. Boundaries keep everyone safe and equal. Let's talk a little bit more about these important aspects of boundaries. Boundaries help other people know how to treat you. And in doing so, when we establish really good boundaries with others, we keep our role clear with them, and this helps to define appropriate behavior for you and the people whom you encounter. And boundaries help you to engender legitimate trust from children and adults with whom you work. If they know that your boundaries and roles are clear, they're going to be more trusting, and rightly so. Boundaries help you to define your sense of self. I love this picture of this cat looking at the lion in the mirror. If any of you have lived with a cat like I do, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Boundaries model to others that you are a secure person. And boundaries can help you to be an example of self-awareness to the people that you work with, particularly children. Boundaries delineate how much you have to give to another person or group of people. Boundaries let others know what to expect of you and what not to expect of you. Boundaries help you to avoid being overextended by the needs of one person. Those of us involved in the work of the church know who that person is, the person who really has needs that sometimes overwhelm the needs of other people, and it is important that we establish boundaries with them. And boundaries help you to equalize your time among the children and adults with whom you are working. Boundaries are dividing lines between you and everyone else that represents both physical and emotional limits that others may not violate. This models personal safety for you and the people you're working with. It ensures consistency in your approach to others. And again, as we said earlier, it keeps the roles very clear. And it also teaches personal and social responsibility to young people, particularly. Boundaries separate your needs, wants, desires, thoughts, and feelings from others. And in doing so, we make sure only healthy needs are met. In working with kids, we're cautious in what we share with them. And we don't confuse our needs with those of the kids we are working with. I tell the story of the youth minister who used to walk up to children and say to them, "I think you need a hug." And I think all of you, hopefully, watching this slideshow know what that person was really saying. They were really saying that they needed the hug, and they were confusing and projecting their needs onto the children. And that's a really unsafe lack of boundaries. Avoid projecting these things onto the kids that you're working with. And it's okay to have an unspoken thought. For extroverts like myself, that may be a difficult thing to admit, but separating our needs, wants, and desires, thoughts, and feelings from others means sometimes we have to be quiet. Boundaries keep everyone safe and equal. That means that the same rules apply to everyone. It means that favoritism can be damaging. And it means, most of all, that when there is a prevailing culture of safety, everyone is safe, and when exceptions are made, no one is safe. Let me repeat that. When there is a prevailing culture of safety, everyone is safe, and when exceptions are made, no one is safe. If you make exceptions to child safety policies, for example, having the policies really doesn't make much sense, because it's when exceptions are made that safety is compromised and people can get hurt or confused. Here are some clinical terms that are going to help you out when you're working with kids and trying to keep them safe. They're not overly complex. The first term is ew, and the second term is ick. And the reason I bring these up is that, of course, this is kind of a funny way to say that you and I, hopefully, have a switch inside of us that goes off when we see something that just doesn't look or feel right. We see an encounter between an adult and a young person, or between two young people, or between two people in general, that just seems a little creepy, a little strange, and it sets off that ew feeling in your gut, the icky feeling that you get when you see an inappropriate touch or an inappropriate statement. I've had that experience working in youth ministry years ago, and it's really important to trust that feeling. It's really important that if you see something that just doesn't feel right, there is a possibility it may not be right, and you may need to check it out. So these clinical terms of ew and ick are just there to ensure that you trust your internal feelings. And if you see something that sets off these yucky feelings, then you might want to talk to somebody about it right away, preferably a person in charge or a trusted confidant who may have a trusted professional opinion. Now we're going to take a self-assessment of all you know about child abuse and neglect. I've never known anyone to get 100% of these questions correct, but let's try anyway. True or false? 32% of child abuse and neglect victims are under the age of 4. This is true. If you think about it, under the age of 4 means infants, and infants are incredibly vulnerable human beings. They depend on us adults for everything, including feeding and changing and taking care of their health and safety. Children under the age of 4 are also not very good reporters of child abuse because many of them do not have the language development or the social skills development to be able to be good reporters. And so they are particularly vulnerable victims of child abuse and neglect. Girls are more likely than boys to experience sexual abuse. True or false? The answer is true. And depending on the data you use, girls are upwards of 4 times more likely to experience sex abuse. Now, that number changes from time to time in different studies, and that's because more boys are reporting abuse than before. As we see a greater acceptance in our churches and in our society, for example, of things like gay marriage and other gay relationships, we are seeing more boys reporting because they're not so afraid that they're going to be stigmatized negatively if their abuser is male. And so this, of course, reminds us of how potentially damaging it is to children when we are negative about homosexuality in our society, because it does prevent a lot of kids from reporting child abuse. However, even with that adjustment in mind, girls are more likely than boys to experience sexual abuse, and they tend to be more sexually vulnerable than boys. True or false? Hispanic children have the lowest prevalence of child abuse in the United States. The answer is false. Child abuse is not culturally dependent in the United States. It crosses all cultures. True or false? A child living with his or her parent and the parent's live-in partner is 8 times more likely to experience child abuse and neglect than a child living with both birth parents. That, unfortunately, is true. A lot of child abuse reports come in that involve a step-parent or a live-in boyfriend or girlfriend, more often a live-in boyfriend. For example, the phenomenon known as shaken baby syndrome, which some of you may be aware of, the highest risk that a baby has in a shaken baby case is living with a male step-parent. So this is just something to be aware of. You're not going to go on a witch hunt, I would hope, for all step-parents in your congregation, because there are many of us out there, including myself. But for those of us who are step-parents, it's just good to know, those people who are parents, that if you have kids living in blended families, there may be more risk of abuse or neglect. True or false? Homosexuals are more likely to sexually abuse children than heterosexuals. That's false. The highest prevalence of abusers actually is among heterosexual men, and actually heterosexual married men make up the highest group of abusers. That doesn't mean that no gay people abuse children or that all straight people abuse children. It just means that statistically, targeting homosexuals as child abusers just doesn't make any sense at all. Unemployed parents are more likely to abuse their children than are employed parents. Is this true or false? It's true. Now, note that this does not necessarily mean socioeconomic status or class. So, an unemployed sanitation worker and an unemployed bank president are equally more likely to abuse their children than are their employed counterparts. It doesn't have to do with how much money they make when they're working. It has to do with the stress of unemployment. True or false? In church settings, clergy are more likely to abuse children than non-clergy. That's false. There's no one occupation that makes for higher risk of offending. We hear more about clergy cases because they're more famous or infamous, but they are no more numerous than others. True or false? More than half of all child abuse reports come from the victim's parents. Think about that for a minute. That is false. Barely 1/4 of all reports, if that many, come from parents, with schools making the most reports, followed by hospitals and mental health centers. Remember that in the case of child injury, for example, there is a high percentage of probability that the abuser is one of the child's parents. Sadly, in the case of child murder, there's a greater than 90% chance that the murderer is one of the child's parents. And so parents generally don't report themselves, and that's why child abuse reports don't often come from parents. And sometimes children will trust a counselor or a teacher before they will talk to their parents because they fear being judged negatively for making the report. 1 in every 58 children in America were abused last year. Is that true or false? That is true, and a recent study showed that child abuse deaths were up for 2011 and 2012. Now, these statistics are getting 2 or 3 years old, and so that may have changed a bit. But overall, reports of child abuse in New England actually have gone up since these statistics, and largely that's been attributed to many, many cuts, deep cuts in prevention programs because of lack of funding. Let's shift to looking at types of child abuse and neglect. There is physical abuse, and that involves hitting, burning, or cutting a child, deprivation of a child on purpose, restraining a child, or symptom induction, also known as Munchausen's by proxy or factitious disorder by proxy. So hitting children, in the United States, spanking is not illegal, even though many of us who are professionals in the field believe that it's rather irresponsible and not all that effective. It is a form of violence, but spanking is not considered illegal. Hitting a child with an implement or leaving a bruise on a child or hitting a child with great force, however, is illegal, of course, and considered child abuse. Unfortunately, there are children who are burned with cigarettes and lighters, and they are cut as forms of discipline. These are extreme cases. Sometimes children are deprived of food for extended periods of time as a form of punishment. Sometimes children are restrained. There was a case that I was involved in where an autistic child was strapped to his bed every day when his mother went to work. And then there's symptom induction. This is very rare, but in some cases, a parent will induce medical or mental disorder symptoms in a child to get attention as a caregiver. You may think of other forms of physical child abuse and neglect, but these are the most prevalent. There's also emotional, mental, and verbal abuse that involves name-calling, threatening a child, exposing a child to domestic violence, which is the most harmful form of child abuse that there is, by the way, exposing a child to domestic violence, a lack of support or nurturing for a child, exposure to adult conflict. And so when you have two people, for example, who are divorcing and can't get along, and they bring the child into that conflict, that's a form of child abuse. Bullying, of course, is another type of child abuse and neglect that we hear a lot about. And there are others. Neglect. Neglect involves medical neglect, failing to take a child in for routine medical care or emergency medical care or preventive medical care. There's also failure to thrive. This is, of course, non-organic failure to thrive. Organic failure to thrive would be a child that has an absorption issue. Non-organic failure to thrive would mean not feeding the child. And then there is scholastic neglect, not sending a child to school, or homeschooling a child when one is not qualified to do so. Failure to protect a child from abuse is another form of neglect. What if someone gets hooked up with someone who's a known child abuser but doesn't protect their child from him or her? Well, of course, that's failure to protect. And lack of hygiene and clean surroundings is way too prevalent. This involves babies crawling through litter boxes and living in filthy conditions and sometimes becoming very sick because of unclean surroundings. And there are probably other types of neglect that you can think of. And then there is sexual abuse, which involves touching a child or penetrating a child, either orally or anally or vaginally with fingers or with the penis or with other objects. There is sexual suggestiveness, and that's grooming. And we'll talk a little bit more about grooming in the video, but the grooming process starts with breaking down some of the barriers that children have against being sexually abused. Exposure to adult sexuality, watching adults having sex or being exposed to adult pornography. Exploitation of children, human trafficking of children, selling one's children for sexual favors. There are, believe it or not, out there parents who will sell their teenage sons and daughters for sex acts in return for drugs. And then rape, of course, is a type of sexual abuse, and one could argue that whenever an adult has sex with a child, it's probably rape because consent is lacking. And there may be other forms of sexual abuse.
Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Barter, and I'm here to talk to you about a subject that may be a bit uncomfortable, but something that we as church people need to talk about, and that is child sex abuse. Let me begin by saying that I have been a forensic psychologist since I began my pre-doctoral fellowship in 2002, and prior to that was a master's level therapist for 8 years, working primarily in child abuse prevention and treatment. And I could no sooner than anyone tell you who is a sex abuser and who is not a sex abuser based purely on demographics, psychological testing, income level, race, ethnicity, occupation, age. Those things just don't predict sex abuse. It is behavior that really tells us whether a person is a sex abuser or not, whether someone abuses children or not. So with that warning in mind, then we all have to be very careful about the issue of sex abuse and how to prevent it, at least to the greatest extent possible in our churches, schools, and other religious institutions. There are 3 categories of sex abusers. One of them would be known as pedophiles. Those groups of people are actually sexually attracted to children, and they use children, images of children, physical contact with children as means of sexual arousal and sexual gratification. That is also known in the field of psychology as a paraphilia. And it's an abnormal sexual attraction. It's not normal for adults and children to have sexual activity, and it's very hard to treat. And in many cases it just simply needs to be regulated, and those are a lot of the folks that we see, for example, on the sex offender registries, where we keep good tabs on where these people are. So that's one category of sex abuser, the pedophile. Another category of sex abuser may be someone who is not a pedophile, not necessarily a bad person at all, but they somehow violate a boundary with a young person. It may not be with a young child, maybe it's with a teenager, but they just exercise really poor judgment. And that person makes a mistake that they may never make again by getting into a poor boundary situation, allowing themselves to be pulled into an unhealthy relationship or unhealthy situation with someone who is a minor or someone in their care. The third category would be the person who's antisocial. Now, the term antisocial is probably one of the greatest misused terms among non-psychology types. People often use the term antisocial to talk about people who are shy or don't like to go out into public. Those people are not antisocial. They are asocial, or they are socially withdrawn. A person who is antisocial in psychological terms is someone who does not conform to society's norms. They are not pro-social. And so the jails and prisons are full of people who are antisocial. And sometimes people have an antisocial attitude that the rules and laws do not apply to them. And so those folks can also be at risk for abusing children physically, sexually, emotionally. Now, when it comes to the safety of children, what's the difference between these 3 groups of sex offenders? And my answer is absolutely nothing. For our purposes of keeping children safe, it doesn't matter whether a person is a pedophile, whether a person is prone to making stupid mistakes, or whether the person has an antisocial personality. The policies that we put in place and the practices that we put in place really should be the same with all people, so that we keep our children safe. Since we don't know who sex offenders are in many cases, we just have to be very vigilant, and we cannot make exceptions to our rules about child safety. One really good rule to help you is that it's important to know people. If someone comes to your church and they want to work with youth and you've never met them before, there may be some great enthusiasm because this person's willing to volunteer with your young people. This may be a young person themselves and you think, great, we have somebody to work with our young people. But do you know this person? So it's really good for your church, school, or religious institution to have at least a 6-month policy where they belong to your organization, they worship with you regularly, they get to know your people, and you get to know them for at least 6 months. Get to know them before they get to know your children. Another rule is that you always want to get people to fill out an application if they want to work with youth. And that isn't just for paid staff, but also volunteer staff. You want people to fill out an application that says who they are, where they've lived, who they're in relationship with, and where they've worked with youth before. Have they ever gotten in trouble before in working for a church? Now, they may not even tell you entirely the truth on their application, so you also want to get background checks. Now, background checks should not be family members, they should not be roommates or very close friends, but they should be people with whom these folks have worked or by whom these people have been supervised. People who can give really good background checks. When a person fills out an application to work with young people, you want to be very mindful of things like, are there gaps in employment or gaps in volunteer work? If the person hasn't been involved in youth ministry for a few years, why is that? You want to get answers to questions from people about why they want to work with youth in the first place. There are certainly sample applications that are out there that could help you, but make sure everyone does an application and everyone gets a background check, and please do not make exceptions to these rules, because making exceptions is where we get into trouble. Another question that people ask often, and we run into sometimes in our synod and in our churches, is what if a known registered sex offender wants to join the congregation? And that is something that each congregation is going to have to deal with the mutual ministry committee, with the pastoral team, with the church council, and you may each have different approaches or different ideas about that, but here are some really important things to keep in mind. First of all, there needs to be a disclosure of some kind. If a person is a registered sex offender, the whole purpose of their being registered is that their sex offense is not private. And so they do not have a legitimate expectation of privacy around sexual offending. And so it is perfectly appropriate for you to sit down with that person and say, look, you can join our congregation, but here are the rules. Number one, people need to know that you're a registered sex offender. If they're a registered sex offender, they should understand that. Secondly, there should be a respectful disclosure to the congregation that this person is interested in joining. And third, of course, this person is never to work with young people under the age of 18 in your church, supervised or otherwise, and they should never be on the premises of your church unsupervised or unaccompanied. So, good common sense rules about registered sex offenders. Most registered sex offenders, I would say mostly all, are on the registry for really good reason. It's very rare that someone's on the sex offender registry by mistake. So if they're on the registry, then you definitely want to put these safety policies in place. There are other general child safety policies that we talk about. Never having somebody work alone with children. Always being accompanied by another adult, and that adult not being related to the first adult. That's really important. Other safety concerns are modeling good, safe behavior in front of our children and around our youth programs. But most importantly, remaining vigilant. And I cannot stress enough that we should never make exceptions to our child safety policy, because it's when we make exceptions or when we let our guard down that somebody who is a sex offender could be in our midst. Keep in mind that sex offenders are among the most patient people you will ever meet. Let me repeat that because it's important. Sex offenders are among the most patient people you will ever meet. They will sometimes insert themselves into a situation where there are children. They may groom children for sex offending for a period of 6 months to a year or more. And so to think that a sex offender is going to come into your church and immediately sort of reveal themselves as this unsavory person is unrealistic. A sex offender is probably going to put themselves in a situation where they have access to children, and they're going to be very patient about it. And so that's why we can't even just rely on the 6-month rule to give us entirely the assurance we need that this person is not risky. You need to do the background checks. You need to do the application, check your sex offender registry to make sure that person's not on the registry, and do all of those things, cross the T's, dot the I's, to make sure that children are kept safe. We know that one sex offense against a child is too many. It can destroy a congregation, it can destroy a family, and it can destroy a child. It can cause great trauma to a child, and none of us want that to happen. So we want to be very vigilant. We want to follow the rules, and in that way, we are good, responsible Christians keeping our children safe. Thanks for watching this video. Good, responsible Christians keeping our children safe. Thanks for watching this video.
So here's a quiz about what is safe and what is unsafe. As a response to the clergy sex abuse scandal, the Roman Catholic Church has initiated a screening process for seminary applicants to eliminate homosexuals from the priesthood. Is this a safe or an unsafe practice? It is unsafe because it gives a false sense of security. Homosexuals are less likely, actually, than married males who identify as heterosexual to sexually abuse children. Now, in fairness to the Roman Catholic Church, it's probably one of the safest places for a child to be nowadays because they have very strict child safety policies in the United States. That's a big change from years ago, and it was brought about, of course, by a very painful process. So to be fair to the Church, in general, their child safety policies are actually pretty good, but the seminary policy is really outdated. Safe or unsafe? Bobby, a very mature 20-year-old, is asked to drive 3 middle school kids to a church-sponsored dance at the neighboring church. He has a perfect driving record. Is this safe or unsafe? It's unsafe. No church should have a minimum age less than 21, and 25 is the preferred age. In fact, check with your insurance company because 25 is the preferred age for most insurance companies. Driving records and license numbers are to be on file with the church if this person's going to drive your children anywhere. Safe or unsafe? At a youth event, Pat sits on Chris's lap, and they are obviously affectionate. Everyone at church knows they're dating, so you allow this to occur. It's unsafe. Sexualized or otherwise physically intimate behaviors do not belong at a church-sponsored event. During a rainy day activity, small activity groups are formed for breakout sessions. There's a shortage of qualified teachers, so one group meets in a closed room, unsupervised. You allow this because all of the kids in this particular group are pious Lutherans. Unsafe. Did any of you not get this right? No exceptions to the policy, please. Kelly's doing an art project. When she rolls up her sleeves to wash her hands after finger painting, you notice a lot of bruises. When you ask about them, she says she does not know where they came from. You suspect abuse, and you decide to make a report to Child Protective after consulting your colleagues. That's safe, and it is the law in every state in the New England Synod. Now, let me be clear that you should not be the Lone Ranger out there looking for child abuse in your congregation and reporting every child with bruises. You need to consult with someone. You need to consult with another teacher or with the Sunday school superintendent or pastor or someone. Don't do this on your own. And there may be a reason for the bruises. The child may have a medical condition, for example. But the rule is that you report suspected abuse. If you have any suspicion that a child is being abused or neglected, then you are obliged, in all the New England states, if you're a Sunday school teacher, you are obliged to make a report, or make a to the state, or to make a report to the person who reports to the state. It's really good, I think, for the churches to each have their own designated mandated reporter, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Safe or unsafe? A number of members of your congregation have web-enabled phones and snap pictures of the kids at the Christmas pageant to post on their personal Facebook pages. That's unsafe. You need to have a church photo policy for children, and you need to follow it. You do not have permission to post these pictures personally. Make sure a permission is on file for each child pictured. A good solution to this is for the church to have a Facebook page and to have one or two monitors of the Facebook page, a moderator or two, who decides what pictures go on the page and what don't. Because in that way, you can make sure that any children who are pictured on the Facebook page have a photo permission slip on file. And there are good reasons for and against posting pictures of people on your Facebook page, and you need to talk about that as a congregation. Abelard, a 25-year-old youth minister, has made comments to you about the physical attractiveness of some of the youth. That is unsafe. Abelard needs to go today, and you document the interaction that you have with Abelard. Don't meet with him alone, and you tell staff, if you are working with a staff, you tell the staff, the professional staff at the church or school, that you have let him go. But please document that interaction. You overhear another teacher telling a kid that their answer to a question was stupid. You report this to the church staff. That is safe. You want to report any suspected emotional or verbal abuse to superiors, as well as physical abuse. In your church, the parents of all children are invited to participate in safety training for children. In fact, you have now opened up the safety training to all adults and youth. Is this safe or unsafe? I hope you got this right. It is safe. Open your training to everyone and make kids even more safe. Wouldn't it be great if every single member of our congregations took the child safety training? What a safe place it would be for children. You do not believe that children under the age of 18 should know basic age-appropriate terminology about sexual anatomy. That's generally considered unsafe. Kids without language are very poor reporters of abuse, and they're also more likely to remain silent out of shame about their sexual organs and about sexual things. Now notice I say age-appropriate and very, it's not that we're going to start teaching sexual anatomy in our Sunday school classes. This is really just kind of an informative slide. But it is important for children to have appropriate language for sexuality. You're cool. You've had your share of dating disasters. You can share this with the youth group once in a while so they can relate to you, right? Wrong. It's unsafe and it's really dumb. Don't share personal information with kids or in front of kids ever, please. That's such a bad boundary violation. A child tells you, I want to tell you something about my coach at school, but you have to keep it a secret. You agree not to tell anyone for fear that if you do, the child will not disclose anything to you. Is that a safe idea? It is unsafe. Don't make that promise. You are a mandated reporter for one thing, and studies show that telling the child you cannot keep that secret will not prevent him or her from disclosing. Better than 90% of the kids who approach you with that particular request will still tell you what they want to tell you, even if you say that I'm a mandated reporter and I have to tell. One of the ways to approach a child who comes to you and says, I want to tell you something but don't tell anybody, is just to simply remind them that your number one responsibility is their safety. And you are not doing your job and you are not keeping them safe if you help them to keep secrets that are not safe secrets. And usually just that little bit of education is enough. And if the child has already told you that they want to tell you something that is that much of a secret, they've already started to make a disclosure to you. So don't fall into that trap of promising that you won't tell something that you really know you have to. Let's talk a bit about mandated reporting. There are procedures in every state. It varies among the states in terms of who is mandated and who is exempted. Sunday school teachers, youth ministers, pastors are all mandated in all 6 New England states. In a couple of New England states, the seal of confession between a pastor and a penitent is still protected, but that's less and less the case. And there is a chain of accountability for reporting, and you should have one within your church. For example, at our Camp Calumet, the Lutheran camp, generally speaking, the director of the camp is the mandated reporter, and so people make their reports to him. And if he's not there, then a delegated person would make the report. It's important to have a buck stops here type of person who knows what's being reported from the congregation. People who report are immune from litigation. If you make a report and it ends up being false or unfounded, you cannot be sued by the person whom you reported. And there are penalties for failing to report. For those who are professionally licensed, like myself, it could mean loss or suspension of a license. There could be fines in some states for failing to report, particularly if a child is hurt after someone fails to report. And don't be afraid to consult with other people when in doubt. Identify an expert in your community, your church community, your local community. And I recommend using a worksheet to facilitate the reporting. Most states have a worksheet, and there are some sample forms available, I believe, that have a worksheet of what you might need to know before you make the report, and it just makes the report much more efficient. Let's talk about bullying. This is a big topic these days. Sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's not very subtle. It usually involves an imbalance of power of the bully over the person being bullied. It is self-perpetuating. In other words, if it's allowed to continue, it just gets worse. Bullying tends to be indifferent, and that is that the bully turns off their sense of empathy toward the person. Bullying is, of course, unchristian and unacceptable. Targets of bullying tend to be people who have atypical body shape and size. Targets of bullying are people who have a particular sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation. This also goes for gender identity or gender expression, males who are not masculine enough, females who are not feminine enough, and then disability. And we're not talking only about people who use wheelchairs, for example, but even people with less visible disabilities, such as autism, tend to be the targets of bullying. Bullying behaviors can be physical aggression toward the person being bullied or verbal aggression. There can also be relational bullying, which is excluding the bullied person from cliques and small groups of people who kind of push them out. And sexual harassment, making an unwanted sexual advance against someone in your care or exposing someone to an uncomfortable sexual environment is also considered bullying. Bullies need consequences for the bullying. Do not engage in a power struggle with a bully. Trying to out-bully a bully never works. Bullies need to be taught how to make it right and to take ownership of their actions. They need to change their view of themselves in relation to other people, and they need to find alternative behaviors. These are all things that you may not be able to do, but hopefully someone treating that bully or working with them could do that with them. We run into the phenomenon of cutting behaviors, particularly in teenagers. Cutting is trauma-related, and sometimes it's possible personality pathology. Sometimes if a young person has some personality structure issues, they will cut themselves. More often than not, it's related to some sort of trauma or some sort of mood disorder. It is a learned behavior. Kids who cut usually learn it from other kids who cut. It's many times more benign than it looks because it can look very scary. However, and here's the big warning, it should not be ignored. Studies show that cutting behaviors are always should always be considered a suicide risk. And as the person who cuts gets older, particularly if they begin to cut in adulthood, the risk of suicide goes up. If you notice that a child is cutting, please don't panic. Don't scream and run out of the room. Don't stigmatize the person. If the cutting is recent, check in with the parent or the guardian or someone whom you and the child might be able to trust. And the vast majority of cutting behaviors are transient and treatable. Most of them go away at some point, and those cutting behaviors that don't go away, of course, require much more targeted treatment, sometimes into adulthood. Here are some sample prevention strategies, and your church or other religious institution or school may have other ideas, but here's some basic ones. There should be a minimum of 2 adults at all times with young people, and one adult must be 21 or older. The other adult could be 18 or older. And in working with youth, particularly middle school and high school, at least one adult must have attained the age of 21 and must be at least 4 years older than the oldest youth in the group. So if you have an 18-year-old in the youth group, then 21 would not be old enough. No unrelated adult should be with a youth or child alone at any time. Many child safety policies do allow for a second adult to be within earshot. For example, if you're helping a young child in the restroom at Sunday school, station another adult outside the door and so that they can hear what's going on. There should, of course, be windows on classroom doors, or the door should be kept open if there are no windows. No adults and children together behind closed doors. No unrelated teenager with a younger child alone at any time. Again, someone, an adult, could be within earshot of that interaction. There should be proper age-appropriate restraints in all vehicles transporting children and youth. Follow your state laws regarding that. No drivers under the age of 25 are to transport unrelated children and youth on behalf of the church. Remember that when you gather at a church and put people in other people's cars, you are taking on tremendous liability, and that liability accrues to the church. And all adults transporting children and youth will agree to a driving background check, and they may be asked to have their license and insurance information on file with the church. And just because someone has an active license now doesn't mean that they don't have a history of convictions for driving violations. Another few strategies. All adults who wish to work with children and youth will agree to a background check when requested. It's a good idea to update those once in a while. And you should require this of your pastors. You should require it of everyone. No photographs or other recordings of youth or children should be used for the web or print publications without the written consent of the parent. And such consent would outline the potential risks of publication of images and recordings, such as the exploitation of children. In my congregation, when we produce a brochure, we use stock images of children and families that we buy from a modeling company, and we don't use pictures of our own kids. No child or youth shall participate in an activity without parental permission. When the parent delivers the child to a church-sponsored event, permission is assumed, and when the activity takes place off church grounds, such consent must be in writing, and it must grant emergency medical care permission to the adults in charge, and the adults should be given contact information for emergencies. Again, these are samples. Your particular institution may have different ways of doing the same sort of thing. So this is it. This is the wrap-up and assessment. You might want to ask yourself what you learned today at this training. And if you have any questions or any discussion, feel free to email me your questions or email your questions to the New England Synod, and we'll make sure that those questions get answered.